Most warriors throughout history worried about enemy blades. Vikings worried about their lunch. Food was abundant. Their farms produced plenty. The real problem was their ships. Those sleek longboats that terrorized Europe for 3 centuries. They had no kitchens, no cooking fires, not even a small hearth. This single engineering choice forced an entire civilization to transform the disgusting into the edible. The foods that resulted served survival needs. They were chemical experiments conducted without laboratories, preservation techniques discovered through desperation, and survival solutions that modern chefs still can't stomach. The Viking menu at sea reads less like a cookbook and more like a chemistry textbook written in blood, bile, and fermented shark. The most basic Viking sea provision looked harmless enough. Harrowfiska, dried fish, except this wasn't the tender jerky we know today. Archaeological finds show these preserved cod slabs had the consistency of wood planks. Vikings didn't eat them so much as assault them. The preparation process involved beating the fish with wooden mallets until the fibers separated enough to chew. Even then, most sailors soaked the beaten fish in water for hours before attempting consumption. The drying process itself was brutally efficient. Fresh cod hung in the cold Nordic air for months. The combination of wind and near-freezing temperatures pulled every molecule of moisture from the flesh. What remained was pure protein that could last years without spoiling. No salt needed. Too expensive for common sailors anyway. Just air, cold, and time-transforming soft fish into edible stone. This preservation method determined everything about Viking naval logistics. A single dried fish weighed a fraction of its original mass, but retained nearly all its nutritional value. Ships could carry months of protein in the space. Fresh fish would spoil within days. The trade-off was texture. Skeletal remains from Viking settlements show distinctive wear patterns on teeth, grooves and chips from gnawing through these protein planks day after day. The fish had to be this hard. Anything softer would absorb moisture from sea spray and rot within weeks. The brutal texture reflected careful calculation rather than poor craftsmanship. Every voyage began with barrels of these fish stones, enough to sustain a crew across the North Atlantic. The sagas mention warriors breaking teeth on particularly stubborn pieces. Ship inventories list mallets specifically for food preparation, alongside weapons and tools. The efficiency was remarkable. One preserved cod provided the same protein as several fresh fish, while taking up minimal cargo space. This density mattered when every square foot of deck space meant another warrior, another trade good, or another day at sea. The rock-hard fish that destroyed Viking teeth also enabled their expansion across Europe and beyond. The Magnus Erlingsson saga records the standard Viking sea ration with disturbing precision: 880 grams of flour and 285 grams of butter per man per day. Not cooked into bread, not heated into porridge, mixed cold and eaten raw from communal barrels. This approach reflected physics, not poverty. Without cooking fires, Vikings created the most calorie-dense paste possible. The mixture had the consistency of wet cement and probably tasted worse. Warriors would reach into barrels, scoop out their daily portion and force it down. The fat content was astronomical by modern standards. Nearly a third of the mixture was pure butter. This was a calculated choice. Rowing a longship in North Atlantic conditions burned approximately 5,000 calories daily. The butter flour paste delivered those calories in the most compact form possible. English chroniclers who encountered Vikings described them as gluttonous, eating amounts that seemed obscene. But this interpretation missed the biological reality. The human body operating in sub-zero temperatures while performing intense physical labor requires massive caloric intake just to maintain core temperature. What looked like gluttony was actually fuel management. Every gram of butter meant another hour of rowing, another degree of warmth against the Arctic wind. The preparation method mattered as much as the ingredients. Flour ground coarse enough to resist moisture, but fine enough to mix with butter. The butter itself churned with extra salt when available, both for preservation and to cut through the overwhelming richness. Some crews added dried herbs or crushed nuts for texture variation rather than flavor. Eating the same paste for weeks could drive men to refuse food entirely, a death sentence on long voyages. Storage presented unique challenges. The butter-flour mixture would separate in heat, spoil in moisture, or freeze solid in extreme cold. Vikings developed specific barrel designs with tight-fitting lids and interior compartments to maintain consistency. The barrels themselves became valuable enough to appear in inheritance documents. A good provision barrel could mean the difference between successful voyage and starvation. The psychological impact was severe. Saga accounts describe warriors dreaming of hot meals, fantasizing about fresh bread while choking down another handful of cold paste. Some men made eating competitions out of necessity. Who could consume their ration fastest? Who could go longest without gagging? The butter bomb was more than food. It was a daily test of will that separated successful Vikings from those who never made it home. Below deck, in the darkest part of the ship, sat barrels that reeked like death. Inside, chunks of meat and fish floated in cloudy liquid, sour whey, the waste product from cheese making. This wasn't spoilage, it was preservation through controlled rot, a process Vikings stumbled upon through desperation and refined through generations. Whey contains lactic acid. Though Vikings didn't know the chemistry, they knew only that meat submerged in this sour dairy waste lasted months without putrefying. The process was revolting. Fresh meat would bubble and foam as bacteria began their work. The smell could clear a deck. But after several weeks, the meat stabilized into something technically edible. Sour, slimy, but safe. The economics made this method essential. Salt required trade or laborious extraction from seawater. But whey, every farm that made cheese produced gallons of it. What aristocrats threw away, common Vikings turned into preservation medium. A single barrel of whey could preserve enough meat for a month-long voyage. The democratic nature of whey preservation meant even poor farmers could provision sea journeys. Archaeological evidence from ship excavations shows these whey barrels were positioned strategically, far from living quarters, but accessible enough for daily rations. The wood itself absorbed the acid over multiple voyages, creating barrels that could begin preservation even before whey was added. Some barrels passed through families for generations, their acid-soaked wood more valuable than silver. The taste defied description. Imagine meat soaked in spoiled milk, then aged until the proteins began breaking down. The texture ranged from firm to paste, depending on preservation length. Vikings developed specific techniques for making it marginally more palatable. Quick rinses in seawater, mixing with crushed herbs, or simply swallowing without chewing. The key was speed. The longer it stayed in your mouth, the worse it got. Preparation required careful timing. Too little time in whey and the meat would rot mid-voyage. Too long and it dissolved into inedible mush. Vikings marked barrels with symbols indicating preservation start dates, a primitive form of expiration dating. The knowledge of reading these marks could determine whether a crew ate preserved meat or died from food poisoning. The innovation spread beyond Scandinavia. Viking traders introduced whey preservation across their network, though few cultures adopted it willingly. The technique survived longest in Iceland, where isolation and limited resources made every preservation method valuable. Modern Icelanders still produce whey-preserved foods, though mainly as cultural curiosities rather than dietary staples. Nothing went to waste when Vikings slaughtered animals, especially not blood, while meat went into whey barrels and organs into stomachs. Blood transformed into foods that modern health inspectors would condemn on sight. Pult brod, blood bread, appears throughout archaeological sites, recognizable by its distinctive dark residue in cooking vessels. The process was grimly practical. Fresh blood mixed with flour, fat, and whatever grains were available. The mixture baked on hot stones when on land, or dried into hard cakes for sea voyages. The iron content was extraordinary. A single blood cake contained more bioavailable iron than weeks of regular meals. For warriors losing blood through combat and exhaustion, these iron iron bombs meant the difference between recovery and anemia. Blood sausages took the concept further. Intestines, stuffed with blood, fat and barley, then smoked until they achieved the consistency of leather. These could hang from ship beams for months, gradually hardening but never spoiling. Vikings would gnaw off pieces during long rows, the salt and iron providing immediate energy. The taste was metallic, the texture granular, but the nutritional density was unmatched. The religious significance elevated blood foods beyond mere sustenance. Pagan rituals required blood sacrifice, the god's portion. But the blood that didn't splash on altars went into human stomachs. Consuming blood meant participating in sacrifice, even at sea. Christian Vikings later struggled with this practice. The Bible forbade blood consumption, yet maritime survival demanded it. The theological debates filled sagas with arguments about necessity versus divine law. Chemical analyses of remains show sophisticated understanding within these primitive methods. The combination of blood with grain created a matrix that preserved iron in its most absorbable form. The addition of fat prevented oxidation. Salt drew out moisture while adding essential minerals. Vikings might not have understood the science, but they perfected the process through centuries of trial and error. Status played into blood food distribution. Chieftains received first blood from sacrifices, thicker, richer, more prestigious. Common warriors made do with diluted blood mixed with more grain. Ship excavations show elaborate blood food remains in areas associated with leadership, while crew quarters contain simpler versions. Even in desperation foods, hierarchy persisted. The preparation rituals surrounding blood foods bordered on ceremony. Specific individuals handled blood collection, usually those with steady hands and strong stomachs. The mixing required precise proportions learned through apprenticeship. Too much blood and the mixture wouldn't solidify. Too little and it lacked nutritional value. These specialists held positions of respect despite their gruesome work. Hakal represents the absolute peak of Viking desperation cuisine. The Greenland shark's meat contains concentrated urea and trimethylamine oxide, compounds that make it poisonous to humans when fresh. Eating untreated Greenland shark causes effects similar to extreme drunkenness, followed by potentially fatal kidney failure. Yet Vikings transformed this toxic fish into food through a process that still horrifies visitors to Iceland. The fermentation process reads like ancient alchemy. First, the shark was beheaded and gutted. Then, buried in gravel pits for 6 to 12 weeks. The pressure and bacteria slowly broke down the toxic compounds. After excavation, the decomposed shark hung in special drying sheds for several months. The final product reeked of ammonia, the smell of the toxins breaking down into less harmful compounds. Modern celebrity chefs provide visceral testimony to Hakal's intensity. Anthony Bourdain called it the single worst, most disgusting and terrible tasting thing he'd ever eaten. Gordon Ramsay spat it out immediately, describing it as like chewing a urine-infested mattress. Yet Vikings ate this regularly on long voyages. They ate it because Greenland sharks were abundant when other food sources failed. The chemistry behind Hakal would impress modern food scientists. The fermentation process converts trimethylamine oxide into trimethylamine, still unpleasant but not toxic. The urea breaks down into ammonia and carbon dioxide. The months-long process essentially detoxifies the meat through controlled decomposition. Vikings discovered this through what must have been lethal trial and error over generations. Preparation for sea voyages required careful timing. Hakal fermented too long became paste. Not long enough remained toxic. Vikings developed testing methods, small tastes that wouldn't kill but would indicate readiness. The knowledge passed from master to apprentice, each generation refining the process. Some families specialized in Hakal preparation, their expertise valuable enough to trade for land and livestock. The cultural impact extended beyond nutrition. Eating Hakal became a test of manhood. Sagas describe young warriors proving themselves by consuming particularly pungent pieces without flinching. Foreign traders were offered Hakal as tests of commitment. Those who ate it earned respect. Those who refused lost credibility. The shark became a symbol of Viking resilience, transforming poison into power through sheer determination. Storage methods evolved specifically for hakal. Regular barrels couldn't contain the ammonia fumes. Vikings developed ventilated containers that allowed gases to escape while keeping the meat protected. These specialized barrels appear in archaeological sites across the North Atlantic, their distinctive ventilation holes marking them as hakal containers. Food carried social and religious meaning in Viking society. The saga of King Haakon the Good illustrates this perfectly. Raised as a Christian in England, Haakon returned to rule Norway and faced an impossible choice. At a pagan feast, priests presented him with horse liver, sacred food in the old religion. His refusal nearly cost him his throne. Horse meat occupied a unique position in Viking culture. Horses were valuable, used for farming, transportation, and warfare. But at religious festivals, particularly those honoring Odin, horses became sacrificial offerings. The meat was distributed according to strict social hierarchy. Refusing your portion meant rejecting the gods themselves. Archaeological evidence from Icelandic burial sites reveals gendered consumption patterns. Male horses were buried whole with chieftains, companions for the afterlife. Female horses were butchered and eaten, their bones scattered through middens. This distribution was intentional. It reflected deep beliefs about death, gender, and spiritual power. The horses a Viking ate in life influenced their journey after death. The arrival of Christianity created a dietary crisis. The church forbade horse meat consumption, viewing it as irredeemably pagan. Vikings who converted faced choosing between eternal salvation and social isolation. Many attempted compromise, publicly refusing horse meat while privately maintaining the practice. Saga accounts describe secret horse feasts held in defiance of Christian law. The conflict went beyond individual choice. Entire communities split over dietary laws. Christian Vikings reported pagan neighbors for horse consumption. Pagan Vikings excluded Christians from feasts and trade. Food became the battleground for competing world views. What you ate declared your cosmic allegiance more clearly than any spoken oath. King Haakon's solution revealed political genius. When forced to preside over a horse sacrifice, he held a cloth over the cauldron and inhaled the steam without eating. This symbolic participation satisfied neither faction completely, but prevented immediate rebellion. The compromise held long enough for Christianity to establish deeper roots, eventually eliminating horse consumption entirely. The transition took generations. Archaeological evidence shows gradual decline in horse bones at feast sites, corresponding with Christianity's spread. By the 11th century, horse meat had largely disappeared from Scandinavian diets, but remote regions maintained the practice for centuries. Iceland didn't officially prohibit horse meat until foreign pressure in the 18th century. The horse meat controversy demonstrates how Viking foods carried meaning beyond nutrition. Every meal was a statement of identity, belief, and social position. The bizarre foods they ate signaled belonging as well as survival. Refusing hakal, or blood bread, meant more than dietary preference. It meant rejecting Viking identity itself. The Viking longship's missing galley was a deliberate choice that reshaped an entire culture's relationship with food. Every revolting meal, from ammonia-reeking shark to blood-soaked bread, solved a specific problem created by that choice. The Vikings didn't eat these foods because they enjoyed suffering. They ate them because the alternative was not eating at all. Their solutions reveal unexpected sophistication. Without understanding chemistry, they mastered fermentation. Without refrigeration, they achieved years-long preservation. Without modern nutrition science, they created foods that delivered exactly what their bodies needed for extreme physical performance in brutal conditions. The disgust we feel viewing their diet is the luxury of abundance. For Vikings, these foods meant the difference between successful raids and starving at sea. The legacy persists in unexpected places. Modern Nordic cuisine celebrates fermentation, nose-to-tail eating, and preservation techniques pioneered by Vikings. Hakal still appears on Icelandic tables, though now as cultural expression rather than necessity. The blood sausages, dried fish, and fermented dairy that once meant survival have become artisanal products commanding premium prices. But the most relevant lesson is adaptation. It's about adaptation. Faced with impossible constraints, Vikings didn't surrender. They transformed toxic sharks into protein, dairy waste into preservation medium, and animal blood into iron supplements. They showed that the boundary between edible and inedible shifts with necessity, ingenuity, and sheer determination to survive. The next time you face something that seems impossible to swallow, literally or metaphorically, remember the Vikings and their ammonia shark. Sometimes the most revolting option is also the one that gets you home.